There are two people. The first person reads every personal finance book published in the last 5 years and tracks their net worth in a spreadsheet every single week and has 3 different investment accounts and a side hustle and a detailed budget broken into 17 categories and spends roughly 4 hours every Sunday reviewing their financial position. The second person has 1 bank account and 1 investment account, and they put the same fixed amount in automatically every month, and they do not review anything unless something specific changes in their life. Which person do you think is building more wealth? Most people assume the first person. The data says the second person. And the reason why is not what most personal finance channels will tell you, because the reason has nothing to do with investment returns or savings rates or financial discipline. It has to do with something that almost nobody in personal finance talks about honestly: the cost of complexity itself. Marcus spent most of his 20s being the first person. He optimized everything and tracked everything and read everything and adjusted everything, and for almost a decade he was extremely busy with his money and not particularly wealthy. At 34, he met someone who was quietly and significantly wealthier than him on a lower income, and when Marcus asked what they were doing differently, the answer was so simple that he almost did not believe it. Nothing complicated. Today we are going to look at exactly why minimalists get richer than everyone else and why the answer has almost nothing to do with frugality or sacrifice, and almost everything to do with a specific kind of clarity that complexity destroys. Stay with this, because what we are going to look at will change how you think about the relationship between simplicity and wealth in a way that most financial advice never addresses. Let us start with something that is rarely named clearly in financial conversations. Complexity costs money. Not in an obvious direct way like a fee or a subscription. It costs money in a slower and more damaging way, through the decisions it prevents you from making and the decisions it pressures you into making badly. Marcus had 17 budget categories. Every month he would sit down and review them and move small amounts between them and feel like he was being financially responsible. What he was actually doing was spending cognitive energy, mental focus, and decision-making capacity on a level of financial granularity that delivered almost no return. The difference between spending £42 on groceries versus £46 on groceries in a given week is not meaningful. But tracking it feels meaningful. And the feeling of being financially active is one of the most expensive feelings in personal finance, because it replaces the actual work, which is simple and boring and requires almost no ongoing activity, with a performance of financial management that consumes time and energy and produces very little. Researchers who study financial decision-making use a term called decision fatigue. The more decisions you make in any domain, the lower the quality of the decisions that come later. A financial life built on complexity requires hundreds of small ongoing decisions. Which category does this expense go in, and should I adjust my savings? Rate this month, and is this subscription still worth keeping, and should I move this money to a higher interest account? Each of those decisions costs something, even when it costs nothing visible. It costs the mental clarity that would otherwise be available for the decisions that actually matter, the large infrequent ones that determine the shape of your financial life over years, rather than the small frequent ones that feel active but change almost nothing. Marcus calculated once that he spent approximately 6 hours every week on financial management activities that had no measurable impact on his actual wealth position. 6 hours every week across 10 years. That is over 3,000 hours spent actively managing a financial situation that would have grown identically, or better, if he had touched it far less. Here is where the minimalist money advantage becomes concrete and specific and worth paying close attention to. Simplicity in personal finance is not a personality preference. It is a strategy that produces measurably better outcomes than complexity across almost every time horizon that matters. Let us look at why. The first reason is consistency. The single most powerful force in building wealth is not investment returns, and it is not a high savings rate, and it is not finding the perfect financial product. It is consistency over time. A simple financial system is almost always more consistent than a complex one because it has fewer points of failure. A complex system requires your ongoing attention and correct decision-making and emotional discipline at every review point. A simple automated system requires almost nothing from you once it is set up, and it therefore runs correctly during the months when you are busy and the months when you are stressed and the months when you are distracted by something in your life that has nothing to do with money. Marcus discovered this when he went through a difficult personal period at 31. His complex financial system fell apart almost immediately because it required active management he could not give it. The person he would later meet, the one on a lower income who was significantly wealthier, had gone through an equally difficult period 2 years earlier. Their simple automated system had continued running throughout it without requiring a single decision. The second reason is that simplicity removes the gap between knowing and doing. Most people who consume financial content know more than enough to build genuine wealth. The problem is not knowledge. The problem is that complexity creates a permanent gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. There is always one more thing to research and one more account to compare and one more strategy to understand before the system feels ready to implement. Simplicity closes that gap because the system is so straightforward that there is nothing left to prepare for. One account for spending and one account for saving and one investment account funded automatically every month. That is not an oversimplification. That is the architecture that underlies the financial life of almost every genuinely wealthy person Marcus has ever spoken to. Now let us talk about something that affects intelligent, financially aware people more than almost anyone else. The optimization trap. The optimization trap is the belief that if you research thoroughly enough and compare carefully enough and adjust frequently enough, you will eventually find a financial arrangement that is meaningfully better than the simple one you could have put in place years ago. Marcus fell into this trap completely. He spent months researching index funds before choosing one. He compared every savings account interest rate before opening one. He adjusted his investment allocation 4 times in 2 years based on things he had read about market conditions. And none of it, not a single hour of that research and comparison and adjustment, produced a meaningfully better outcome than the simple, consistent approach would have produced. In fact, the adjustments produced a worse outcome in at least 2 cases because they were made in response to short-term information that turned out to be irrelevant over the time horizon that actually mattered. The optimization trap is expensive in a specific way that is worth understanding clearly. The difference in outcome between a good simple financial plan and an optimized complex one is almost always smaller than the difference between a good simple financial plan started today and an optimized complex plan started after 6 more months of research. Time in the market produces returns. Time spent researching the market produces the feeling of progress without the actual progress. Marcus now uses a principle he calls the cost of better. Before researching any financial optimization, he asks one question: what is the realistic improvement this optimization could produce, and what is the cost in time and complexity of implementing and maintaining it? In almost every case, the realistic improvement is smaller than it feels, and the cost in complexity is larger than it appears. And the simple option, the one that requires almost no ongoing management, turns out to be not just good enough but genuinely better when the cost of complexity is properly accounted for. Let us now look at what a genuinely simple wealth system actually looks like, because simplicity in financial life does not mean ignoring your money. It means building a structure that handles your money well without requiring your constant attention. Marcus rebuilt his financial life around 3 pillars, and each one is simpler than almost anything you will find in a mainstream personal finance resource. The first pillar is a single clear direction for every pound that enters your life. Not a detailed budget and not a category system. A single rule for what happens to money when it arrives. Marcus uses what he calls the one decision system. Every time money enters his account, a fixed percentage moves immediately and automatically to his investment account, and a fixed percentage moves to a separate saving account, and the rest is his to spend without tracking or guilt or review. The percentages were set once based on his genuine financial priorities. They have not been changed in 4 years. The system runs without his involvement, and the wealth builds without his management. The second pillar is a single low-cost index fund rather than a portfolio. Marcus spent years building what he believed was a well-diversified portfolio across multiple funds and asset classes. The complexity produced no better outcome than a single broadly diversified index fund would have produced. It did produce significant ongoing management time and several costly decision points where complexity led to worse choices. One fund managed by the market itself rather than by his ongoing judgment has outperformed his managed portfolio in every year since he simplified. The third pillar is a review schedule that is almost comically infrequent by most financial standards. Marcus reviews his financial position twice a year. Not monthly and not weekly and not whenever something interesting happens in the market. Twice a year. And at each review he asks only 2 questions. Is my income still covering my genuine needs, and is the automatic system still running correctly? If the answer to both questions is yes, the review takes approximately 20 minutes and produces no changes. The simplicity is not laziness. It is the result of a system designed to require nothing from him in order to do exactly what it was built to do. Here is the part of the minimalist wealth advantage that is almost never discussed, and it is the part that Marcus considers the most important. Minimalists have a fundamentally different relationship with financial risk than people with complex financial lives. And that difference, over time, is worth more than almost any investment return. Most people think of financial risk as market risk, the possibility that investments fall in value. But there is a more common and more damaging form of financial risk that rarely gets discussed. Behavioral risk. Behavioral risk is the risk that you will make a bad financial decision at a bad time because your financial system is complex enough to give you constant opportunities to intervene. Every time you log in to check your investment balance, you create an opportunity for behavioral risk. Every time you reconsider your allocation, you create an opportunity for behavioral risk. Every time you read a financial article that suggests a better strategy and you feel the pull to adjust your plan, you are standing at a behavioral risk point. The research on long-term investor returns is consistent on this point. Investors who check their portfolios less frequently make fewer adjustments, and those fewer adjustments produce better outcomes than the more frequent adjustments made by investors who are actively engaged with their financial situation. Marcus made 6 significant changes to his investment allocation in his first 8 years of investing. 4 of those changes reduced his eventual return compared to what doing nothing would have produced. 2 of them made no meaningful difference. Not one of them improved his outcome. The minimalist wealth advantage is not just that simple systems cost less time and energy. It is that simple systems produce fewer opportunities for the kind of emotionally driven financial decisions that quietly destroy wealth over time. A system you rarely look at cannot be interfered with. And a system that cannot be interfered with is one of the most powerful financial advantages available to any ordinary person building wealth on an ordinary income. Let us now look at the practical question that most people arrive at after understanding the minimalist wealth advantage. What if your financial life is already complicated? What if you already have multiple accounts and multiple funds and a detailed budget system and a side hustle and several financial commitments that have accumulated over years? Marcus was in exactly that position at 34, and the process of simplifying took him about 3 months. The first step is to separate the complexity that is producing real value from the complexity that is producing only the feeling of activity. Marcus went through every financial account and every financial commitment and asked one question: if I remove this from my financial life, would my actual wealth position be worse in 5 years? Not whether it felt responsible to have it, and not whether other people at his level had it. Would removing it make his actual financial position worse? Most of his complexity did not survive that question. The second step is to consolidate before canceling. The goal is not to reduce accounts for the sake of reduction, but to identify the smallest number of financial structures that handle everything important well. For Marcus, that was one current account and one high-interest savings account and one broadly diversified index fund. The third step, and this one is the hardest for people who have been deeply involved in managing their money, is to deliberately reduce how often you interact with your financial system. Not as an experiment and not temporarily. As a permanent change to how you relate to your money. The financial system Marcus built now runs for months at a time without him touching it. And those months of not touching it are not months of financial neglect. They are months of the system doing exactly what it was designed to do without the interference that would make it less effective. So here is the full picture of why minimalists get richer than everyone else. It is not because they spend less, though they often do. And it is not because they have found a superior investment strategy. They almost always use the most ordinary one available. It is because simplicity removes the complexity tax that most people are paying without knowing it. The tax paid in time and in mental energy and in the decision fatigue that degrades the quality of every financial choice made after 100 small ones. It is because simple systems are more consistent than complex ones, and consistency is the only ingredient in wealth building that cannot be replaced by anything else. It is because simplicity closes the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it, and that gap is where most financial lives quietly stall. And it is because a system you rarely interfere with cannot be damaged by the behavioral risk that destroys returns for even the most financially literate and well-intentioned people. Marcus is not wealthy because he found something complicated that other people missed. He is wealthy because he stopped doing the complicated thing that was getting in the way. This week, take one look at your financial life and ask the honest question: how much of the complexity in my financial system is producing real results, and how much of it is producing the feeling of being financially responsible without actually making me wealthier? Just that one question. Sit with the answer honestly. Because for most people who ask it, the answer points clearly toward a simpler system than the one they currently have. And a simpler system, run consistently without interference, is almost always the most powerful financial decision available. Share this video with one person you know who is working very hard on their money and not seeing the results they expected. Because sometimes the problem is not that they are doing too little. Sometimes the problem is that they are doing too much. I will see you in the next one.